Welcome back to the 10 Adventures podcast. I'm really excited for our chat this week. Throughout my life, I've been fascinated by the Arctic, reading books about exploration, Nansen's crossing of Greenland, Pierre Burton's stories from the Arctic, as well as just, general exploration of this, kind of undiscovered part of the world. And so today we are going to be talking the Arctic. We're going to be exploring Canada's Northwest Passage, talking about Greenland and Iceland, and we have an expert to lead us through this discussion. We have Martin Aldrich from Adventure Canada, an expedition cruise operator that specializes in small boat cruises to the Arctic. Hi, Martin. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Richard. It's great to be here.
So I can't wait to learn more about all these places I've only read about or seen on YouTube. But I think the first thing I'm really interested about is people always think about Antarctica, and that's kind of on most people's bucket lists. And they don't kind of think of, hey, there's this huge Arctic region. How would you compare the Arctic to Antarctica?
Yeah, that's a really great question. It's, they're very similar in some ways and then very different in other ways. So maybe I'll just touch on some of the similarities first, and then we can talk about the differences. But Antarctica, obviously the South Pole, it is a large continent, a large piece of landmass with no permanent residents other than the penguins. So that's a big differentiator, are the penguins. And it's the continent is surrounded by a large ocean all the way around. So that's, one big thing for Antarctica is it's quite far away. So if you're wanting to travel there from Canada, you've got to travel to the southern tip of South America. It's about 24 hours probably to get there from wherever you live, most likely, maybe longer. From Ushuaia, the southern tip of Argentina, you would then take about 2 days on a ship, 2 to 3 days, crossing the Drake Passage, which is a notorious body of water where the currents swell around and creates quite the possibly interesting sea swell. So it can be pretty large sea swell there getting to Antarctica. But then, like I mentioned, there's penguins down in Antarctica. There are lots of migrating whales and birds as well, but no permanent residents. There are anywhere from 1,000 to 5,000 researchers that are actually down in Antarctica at any one time from multiple countries around the world. So that's quite interesting. And then, of course, if you're down there for a cruise, you're looking at pretty large tabular icebergs. That's very common. They're going to be breaking off from the ice shelf, and that's what you're going to see. So, large white continent down in the very southern pole here. When you look at the Arctic, it is actually essentially the North Pole, and the Arctic is a body of water surrounded by islands and the kind of northern parts of multiple countries. It's been inhabited for thousands of years. The Inuit people live there still and have lived there for millennia. And so there is the Inuit culture, which is a big differentiating factor. So you're actually going to be able to visit communities and see people in the Arctic. And then in the Arctic, we have polar bears, but not penguins. So you're going to have the large, fluffy apex predators of the polar bears that you can see on some of the Adventure Canada expeditions to the Arctic, but you won't be seeing any penguins. Typically, or the way I describe some of the birds that are up there, the thick-billed murres are kind of like the penguins of the Arctic. So they are flight birds, so they can fly. But they do look relatively similar to penguins, but they're not related. So those are a couple of the differentiating factors, a couple of the similarities. But of course, when you're looking at going and doing an Arctic expedition, if you're in Canada, we're flying somewhere between 4 to 6 hours or so north. And so it's considerably closer. It's Canada's backyard. Nunavut, one of the 3 territories of Canada, is 20% of the landmass, 80% of the coastline of Canada. And it is very sparsely populated. About 45,000 people live in Nunavut. So vast land. We're looking at I think the southern tip of Nunavut is somewhere around 60 degrees or a little below 60 degrees north. Most of Nunavut is above the Arctic Circle. And Antarctica, the white continent is what it's called. So this is, again, a large white landmass covered in I think a mile and a half or so 3+ kilometers of ice in any given area. Whereas the Arctic, it's sea ice. That's in the actual ice cap, the very top of the world. And then all the different archipelagos around, we have the high peaks of Greenland and Baffin Islands. But then there's also flatter areas. There are very few, above the tree line, there are no trees, but there's certainly open areas of the tundra where you can have smaller plants living. Willow is one of the trees that we would think of down south, and willows grow very low to the ground in the Arctic. So yeah, there's a lot of similarities in terms of it being quite cold, definitely in the winter, and they both have aurora. So you can have the aurora borealis or the aurora australis, so down in the southern pole. But yeah, just a lot easier to get to the Arctic, especially if you live in Canada.
Are the views as dramatic? These visions of these huge ice caps and icebergs. Do people going to the Arctic, do they rave about the views the same way people do when they go to Antarctica?
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, they're different, but absolutely both places very stunning. A lot of dramatic landscape. On Baffin Island in particular, you have 1,000-foot peaks coming right out of the water in these fjords. So you can have a 1,500-foot peak on one side and a 1,000-foot peak on the other, and they're right there. You've got icebergs, of course, as I mentioned, in Antarctica. They're mostly tabular, so flat pieces of ice that have broken off of a glacier. Whereas in the Arctic, a lot of the icebergs are coming out of Greenland, and just the way that they are forming is they come in many different shapes and forms. So you've got like Roman arches, you've got the tabular icebergs as well. There's more rounded icebergs. There are like cathedral-like icebergs. It's really interesting to be floating through Iceberg Alley off of Greenland. Is a particularly beautiful place for the scenery of these floating chunks of ice. There's Canada's northernmost community up in Grise Fjord, and you can imagine yourself being up there living in such a remote place. This is 77, 78 degrees north, and beautiful, stunning scenery there. They have narwhal and beluga whales essentially swimming by the beach fairly regularly. This is a community of 120, 130 people, so this is not a large place. There's a lot of history there that I won't go into now, but it is a really stunning place. You kind of feel like you're sitting on top of the world and you're looking at south to the rest of the world, sitting on top. Yeah. It's
really interesting just to hear all this diversity, and I hadn't really thought of it, but it sounds like you can see a lot more in terms of there's more variety, and you bring in the cultural aspect, which I think is really interesting. My next question is about expedition cruises, and we've seen, a lot of people love cruising, but we've also heard a lot of people where they, cruises are getting bigger and bigger, and cruise ships are holding, I think 5, 6, 10,000 people. And much like travel in general, there's, people that want to get away from this mass tourism and kind of get to more smaller scale, authentic tourism. And so for an expedition cruise, how is that going to change from probably people's expectations of what a cruise is going to be?
For sure. That's a great question. The simplest way to put it, I think, is a mainstream cruise, a larger ship. The focus is a bit more on the ship and the amenities of the ship, versus an expedition cruise. The focus is more on the places that you're visiting. So mainstream cruise, typically much larger. I looked it up. Largest cruise ship in the world right now, 7,600 people, 7,600 people.
Wow.
Huge, bigger than many of the towns in the Canadian Arctic.
It's bigger than, yeah. I think it's probably bigger than any town in Nunavut, isn't it?
Yeah, about the size of Iqaluit, the capital of Nunavut. Yep. So some big ships. Adventure Canada and the ship, the Ocean Endeavour, that we operate on, I like to think of it as a floating university, whereas I would think of a mainstream cruise as kind of like a floating Las Vegas. So you're there for the entertainment. You're not leaving the entertainment, the ship typically that often. If you are, you're walking off into a city. And then if you're in that city, you're either walking around the city or maybe you're paying for an additional tour in that place. So you often have additional costs. When you're going on an expedition cruise, with Adventure Canada, almost everything is included. We have all the excursions off the ship included. And again, the focus is about getting off the ship. So instead of walking off the ship, most of the time you're going to be using it as Zodiac. So we have an expedition team of very capable folks who will be driving these Zodiacs. They come alongside the ship and you take a few steps down with a lot of assistance and step into a Zodiac. And then really that just opens up so many options for us. We have the possibility of staying in the Zodiac for the duration of the outing. So maybe we're looking at some of those icebergs I was talking about. Maybe we're looking at polar bears. Maybe we're out whale watching, or maybe just cruising up a fjord and seeing what we find. We also use those Zodiacs to transfer to communities. So for community visits, pulling onto a pontoon, perhaps it's a beach. Very common to be pulling onto a beach or a rocky outcropping. And then we also do expedition landings as well. So this is where you're going onto the land where no one lives. This is not a community or anything like that. It is just a beautiful area to go for a hike. And that's probably the biggest differentiating factor with an expedition, is getting out onto the land where there really isn't necessarily like a city or a community, and going for hikes. We'd like to do a lot of different levels of hiking. Our main demographic is 55 to 75, well-educated, well-traveled. But mobility levels change. You could have an 85-year-old who wants to do the 10K hike. You might have a 55-year-old who wants to do something like a kilometer long with no elevation gain. We're not typically on paved paths in communities. Sometimes we can have gravel roads and maybe some boardwalks, but typically it's uneven ground. So that's certainly a factor to consider if you're looking at taking an expedition cruise.
Just one question. What's the total size? Like, how many guests are typically on one of the expedition cruises? And then how many staff are there to support them?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. So yeah, you have this large ship with a typical conventional cruise, and we're on a much smaller vessel. This is a 200 passenger vessel. There are 100 crew. And then Adventure Canada staffs specifically for the expedition team members. So these are specialists that are going to be that university aspect of what's going on. So the presentations in the Zodiacs, on the land, on the ship as well, talking about the history, talking about all the different aspects of the area that we're visiting. And we're 198 passengers, as I was mentioning. We're under 200. So we're getting into groups of 10 to 20 for the hikes. There's multiple different presentations happening at the same time. So it's really a small group feel, and there's a lot of time for interacting with the staff and the crew and learning from those specialists that we have on board.
One thing I've always thought is conventional cruising is almost just a different way to go to different cities, that you could go by bus or by car or by plane. It's quite simple to do that. Expedition cruising, it really is the best way to go and see these places, because to do it any other way, to charter a small plane to go and do it, it would be astronomically expensive. And so it's kind of the only way to really do this affordably. And it's actually the best experience because you're on the water going through all these fjords. It feels like this is, okay, cruising is best when you're doing something that this is the only way to do it. But am I right about that? Like, am I maybe romanticizing an expedition cruise?
Not at all. No, I think that's bang on. The whole purpose of expedition cruising really is to get to places that are very hard to get to. They're in Greenland, for example, there are no roads between communities. It is large fjords with a massive ice cap on top of Greenland. You could fly, again, cost prohibitive. Most of the communities that we visit, they would have very small airstrips if they do. And then, of course, those expedition landings, you can't fly into those places. So, when you get onto an expedition, you're unpacking once, you're in the comfort of a nice ship, but then you're able to explore really remote areas. We get remote with the ship, but then, of course, those Zodiacs can take us even further. So you're absolutely right. It's getting to remote places, getting to these far-flung, hard-to-reach places that have very few visitors each year. So you really can feel like you're way out there and you're doing something incredibly special that not a lot of people get to do.
And I know Adventure Canada has cruises all over the world. We're just focusing on the Arctic ones. But can you just talk about, some of the highlights that, the must-sees that, why people want to go to Greenland or Iceland or the Arctic? Because I feel like these places are a lot of people's bucket lists, but it lacks the I have to see this one thing. Whereas, most, I want to go to the Rockies, I have to see Moraine Lake. I want to go to Chile, I have to see Torres del Paine. I feel like their destinations, people kind of don't know what they want to see, but they're intrigued by the remoteness and kind of the mystery of the places.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I hadn't thought about it so much like that. I guess maybe the big draw is polar bears, which aren't in one specific location. They do roam around for hunting and those kind of things. Greenland has some spectacular locations. The UNESCO site in Ilulissat is the fastest moving glacier in the Northern Hemisphere. It's like the stats are staggering, like 30 billion tons of ice a year.
Oh, wow.
That come out of this glacier. So they say something like 85 or 90% of the icebergs that you see in the Atlantic have come out of Ilulissat. So if you're seeing something off of Newfoundland, that's likely come from Ilulissat in Greenland. So that's why it's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. You can see just massive, massive amounts of ice when you're there. So that's definitely a unique location. In the Canadian Arctic, Baffin Island, just the whole thing of it, it's just stunning. Like I talked about the peaks before, the fjords, there are extensive fjords there, lots of polar bears, of course, communities that we can visit as well. So Baffin Island, really, really beautiful place. And it's, the thing there is that you're not going for one thing. It's not just the scenery. You also have the communities. You also have, narwhal, beluga whales. We've got muskox, polar bears. There are so many different species that are roaming around. They're not, again, like the colonies like you'd find in Antarctica where they're in one spot. We're looking and searching around for these different types of mammals that we hope to see.
And you talked a little bit about what a day on, a cruise is, where, most of the day it sounds like you're out exploring, getting to places on a Zodiac that even, the expedition boat can't get to. But what's the rest of the days like? What happens when you come back from, your excursion out exploring the Arctic?
A lot of smiling, typically, when we get back to the ship after those incredible days. All the meals are included, so typically we come back, afternoon tea is served, some nice snacks and refreshments. We have lots of, as I mentioned, the staff on board are highly specialized, so they're going to be doing presentations throughout. So when we have a day at sea, it is typical to have about one day at sea on most of the trips. The exception there being like Iceland circumnavigation, Newfoundland circumnavigation, where we're staying right around landmass. But there's going to be a day at sea, so that day will be filled up with lots of different presentations. So something we haven't talked about yet, but there's a lot of history from the explorers in the Canadian Arctic. So maybe the historian on board will do a presentation about Franklin before we go to Beechey Island, which is another UNESCO World Heritage Site, which is where Franklin's men, those explorers that were destined to cross the Northwest Passage, that was where they first overwintered, and it was the first place they ever found any evidence of their expedition. So maybe we're heading to Beechey Island. The historian's going to talk about that expedition to date and what they know about Franklin and the Erebus and the Terror, the two ships that they were on. It could be an opportunity for you to take some downtime, maybe use the sauna, the hot tub, or the pool. We have workshops as well, so it's not just one presentation by a historian. There will be a marine biologist on board. We're going to have presentations from the climate specialist. We have many Inuit staff on board, so they might be talking about what this particular area means to the Inuit people. We could be, again, doing some of those workshops. So beading workshops, maybe you're doing your own Inuit fish print. So you paint a fish, an actual fish, and then you press it against a piece of paper like you would do with lithography. And then you can do that with one of the artists on board. There's so much. In fact, it's almost hard to take all of the presentations and the workshops in. But yeah, it's again like a floating university. There's so much you can learn, and there's so many different options for all the different interest levels that our passengers typically have.
I think one thing that's really interesting, if you think of these, larger cruise ships, and I go on cruises with my parents that they like traveling that way, but a lot of the time you're in these industrial ports and there's nothing to look at. You look out and you see a working port. It's kind of interesting. My kids like watching the cranes, so we'll do that. I imagine being on the boat, you could just sit outside with a mug of cocoa and I just do that all the time. That's what I'd want to do, is just have a look at, because you're seeing this incredible wildlife and nature all around you in a way that is totally different from bigger cruises where you're always in ports. Like a lot of the cruising's even at night, so you almost sometimes don't even get a feel like you're on a boat. It's more like a hotel that you just kind of wake up in a different industrial port every day.
Yeah, very true. Yeah. I mean, one of my favorite places to be on the Ocean Endeavor is up on the observation deck. So top front of the ship, you have almost an unimpeded view. There's plexiglass to keep the wind off of you, because you are on the Arctic Ocean if you're in an Arctic trip. So it's not warm. It's certainly not parka weather. It typically is above zero, depending on exactly when we're there. It's the best time, in the summer to be up there. And yeah, you can certainly spend a lot of time out on deck taking in the vistas. We have such a large team on the ship that we'll often have 2 to 5 expedition team members up on the observation deck at any one time. They'll have a scope out. They're looking for those narwhal, the belugas, the polar bears. Yeah, all the different kinds of seals that we might see. So it's a pretty exciting place, especially when something, is spotted. All the ornithologists, all the birders are up there looking for all those new species of birds that they're trying to check off their lists. It's an exciting place to be.
And I want to talk a little bit about your probably your 3 most popular trips in the Arctic. And maybe if you want to maybe just run through a little bit what these trips are, how you get to, the start and finish, and, what makes them so special.
Yeah, there's a lot of different trips to talk about, Richard, but I'll try to choose 3. Maybe I'll just start with how we would get there first, because for any of the Arctic trips where we're going to be going far north, we're flying on a charter flight. So Adventure Canada charters planes. They're private for our guests only. All of the trips are open jaw though, so they would start and end in a different place. Typically when we're doing charter flights, and that's because the ship is doing a series of trips back to back to back, and so one trip will start in one place and end in another, so the charter flights go from different places. So maybe let's just start with one of my favorite, Heart of the Arctic. So this is an early season trip for the Arctic, so this is going to be late July into early August. This is southern Baffin Island, northern Quebec, so Nunavik, as well as over to Greenland. This trip is a bit more focused on community visits. There's a lot of fantastic communities in southern Baffin Island that are renowned for Inuit art. So there's also a focus on art. But this is some of the best area for wildlife viewing and dramatic scenery. So it really does have a lot of different aspects to it. That one in particular, Heart of the Arctic, is 13 days. You're going to be in and around the Arctic Circle for the entirety of the trip, so you're not going super far north. We can't go that far north at that time because it's still quite frozen, especially the Northwest Passage. You're going to start by flying from Ottawa up to Iqaluit. You'll then head out of Iqaluit into Frobisher Bay and travel along southern Baffin Island. So this is actually Hudson Strait. So this is how you get into Hudson's Bay. There are some great spots here for wildlife viewing. You might see some mainland caribou. There's definitely good opportunity for large bird colonies in Ngava Bay on Akpatak Island, and the polar bears know about these birds and they come and hunt them. So that's a great opportunity for seeing some polar bears there, and walrus as well in that area. Quite a good opportunity. So that's Heart of the Arctic. Again, a bit more of a community focus with the art focus, but definitely lots of opportunity to see wildlife as well. If we go further north, let me see. Maybe I'll choose the Greenland and Wild Labrador trip, because that one is run every single year. It's typically later in the season, so it starts in Greenland and will go down the coast of Greenland, Labrador, and finish in Newfoundland. It's typically late September into October. This is a 15-day expedition. And I think you get Greenland, always, I love going to Greenland. Super, super beautiful, especially seeing the ice as it comes out of those, off those glaciers. And then you're going to cover the coast of Labrador, which is very infrequently visited. I think it's really not really known by as many people as a destination for travel, and that is probably because it's harder to get to. And one of the highlights would be the Torngat Mountain Range, which is in the northern part of Labrador.
I've had discussions. I'm part of the Alpine Club, and people talk about that as this, tremendously challenging weather, but just no one knows. If this was anywhere else, it'd be a highlight for Canada, but it's so hard to get to, and the weather's so challenging. I love that you mentioned that, because I don't know how many times people have mentioned that to me in the last year.
Yeah, well, Labrador, I think people think of Newfoundland, but it is a province of Newfoundland and Labrador. So it is a large province. Newfoundland is its own island off of the east coast, and Labrador is part of the continental North America. And the Torngat Mountains are the very northern tip of Labrador. You're actually quite close to Iqaluit and Baffin Island there. And, we're lucky with Adventure Canada with having such a great relationship with Nunatsiavut, which is the Inuit peoples that live on the coast of Labrador. And in order for us to go to the Torngat Mountains, because of our relationship, we hire locally for all of the trips, but for Labrador in particular, we hire Nunatsiavut representatives, and they are our bear monitors in the Torngat Mountains. So we are able to visit multiple locations there in the Torngats, and as far as I know, we are the only operator that has that ability to go there. So very hard to get to. Really, an expedition's your only option, and Adventure Canada, as far as I know, is the only operator that goes to the Torngat Mountains.
That sounds beautiful. Now, to get to Greenland at the start, where do people fly in for that one?
So for the Greenland and Labrador trip, we fly from Toronto up to Kangerlussuaq, Greenland. We then join the Ocean Endeavour there and head down the coast of Greenland.
Excellent. And the third one, I'm hoping it's going to be the Northwest Passage, because that's I've read so much about exploration, and I'm just so fascinated by that. So I'm super eager I'm hoping that's what we're going to have for the third one.
Yes, absolutely. Saving the big one for last. So the Northwest Passage, we actually run it twice. So we run into the Northwest Passage, which goes slightly earlier than out of the Northwest Passage. So this is going to be in August, typically mid to late August. We're going to be going from Toronto up to Greenland. We fly into Kangerlussuaq, the same place that we would have started the Greenland and Wild Labrador trip. 17 days on the coast of Greenland, Baffin Island, going into the Northwest Passage, all the way to a place called Kugluktuk, which is at the very western edge of Nunavut, right before the Northwest Territories. This is covering almost the entirety of the Northwest Passage. We really are right at the very western end when we get to Kugluktuk. This is going to cover everything. You're going to cover Greenland. You're going to have the historic sites, the community visits, the wildlife. And this is what Adventure Canada is known for the most part. Our Northwest Passage expeditions are very popular. They typically sell out every year. And you're going to have an incredible team on board that's delivering all of what I talked about, really. Whether it's going to a remote community like Grise Fjord, which we typically only get to on these Northwest Passage trips because they're later in the season. Getting to a community of 130 people at 78 degrees north is just, there's so few people that have gotten to do that. It's a really special and it's really special to meet the community members there. So that typically is one of the highlights, is getting into these even more remote places on the Northwest Passage trips. So yeah, after into the Northwest Passage, 17 days, we finish in Kugluktuk and we fly down to Yellowknife. And the flight that we can't go down on would have brought passengers up for the next trip, which is called Out of the Northwest Passage, another 17-day trip. This is going to be late August into September. Sometimes it's entirely in September, just depending on exactly the scheduling in the year. This is going to go from Kugluktuk to Kangerlussuaq, Greenland, and we'll fly down to Toronto. It's a little bit later in the season, so it's a little cooler. We will have some migratory birds that have started to fly south, so we have maybe fewer birds in the colonies there. But we're at the kind of the zenith of zero, or as little ice as there typically is in the Arctic. So what that allows us to do is to go as far north as we possibly can, to really explore those remote fjords, get to places like Grise Fjord, or even further north in Greenland. They're really special trips. I've been lucky enough to do both of the trips 4 times combined now. And, I have probably 30,000 photos from 4 trips. It's just incredible what you see.
What I think is really interesting is as you talk about these, like day one, you're doing stuff. And you said at the start just how much easier it is to get to these. If you're anywhere in North America or even Europe, Toronto's, super popular airport. You get a direct flight in probably in under 6 or 7 hours. And then you have the charter flights. You don't have to worry about getting to some remote destination. And I used to work in Argentina, so getting down to the south, it's tricky. And if something happens, you get backed up. It's just Aerolíneas Argentinas that is typically doing that route, and it just makes it so much easier. And so, kind of on your day one, you make yourself to Toronto, and then you're heading up, and then day 2, the boat is going, and you're seeing stuff, as opposed to spending 3 days in the roaring 40s, getting seasick. Maybe it's not that bad, but it's like if you go and do a 10-day Antarctic, you're kind of only spending 4 days in what you want to see. It's 3 days there and back, where this is every day is seeing something where it's really efficient in terms of your time, and it's also cheaper. You're looking at all the costs to work out of Antarctica. You just look at the prices. It seems like these trips are better value, cash wise as well.
Yeah, for sure. And you're going to an exotic destination. It's Canada's backyard, but it is incredibly exotic. Like you don't feel like you're in Canada necessarily. You're right into it on day one. Charter flight up, you're flying, say, to Greenland. You're seeing the icebergs below you as you land. We transfer your luggage for you. The bus will take you. There'll be a charter bus that takes you from the airport straight to a pier. You typically are right into it on a Zodiac right away. You're not walking onto the ship typically. So you get that expedition experience right away. And then, once we've done the safety briefing on the ship, we head out on day one, and it's pretty special, that first bit of movement of the ship and getting out there. And then those first days and the last day of a trip they're long. We start early with our charter flight, and we pack a lot in, but you're also getting to see a lot. They're very, very special. The expeditions that I've been on have been different. Every single one is a little different. We can't predict exactly where the sea ice is going to be, where the polar bears are going to go, exactly what communities we can go to. And that's probably one of the biggest things I would also say. A mainstream cruise, you're going to be almost 10 minutes to the schedule getting into ports. It's very predictable. So that's what you need, and that's what you like, then that's for you. But if you want adventure and you want to get out there and not know exactly what's going to happen, this is definitely a trip for you, or a style of travel for you. We have plan A, B, and C, and sometimes plan E is the best. We don't predict where the sea ice goes. And I talked about the Out of the Northwest Passage being sometimes completely ice free. Those early season trips, we definitely can have sea ice pushed by the wind, blocks an area we wanted to go to. Oh, we're going somewhere else. Oh, what do you know? There's, a mother polar bear with 2 cubs in that location, or, it's a fantastic historical site. So you really don't know exactly what each day is going to hold. And that's definitely the part of the adventure that I love.
This has been great to hear about all these different trips, Martin. I'm also a little excited because we're now working with Adventure Canada. So all of 10 Adventures travelers can now book your trips directly on 10 Adventures. And there's an exciting promotion that's going on until, I think it's near the end of September. Do you want to talk a little bit about the promotion for people that want to book their incredible Arctic cruise?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm super excited about the partnership with 10 Adventures too, and excited to offer this promotion to your guests, and hopefully we can get some people on board. So we have until September 19th, we have our big promotion of 25% off, and that includes the Northwest Passage, which is quite rare to have a big promotion like that. So definitely, if you're considering this, I would take a look at the promotion on the 10 Adventures site, and hopefully we can get you on board. It includes both Northwest Passage trips, the Greenland and Wild Labrador that I talked about, the Heart of the Arctic next year. There's also a Baffin Island and Greenland trip, and our Newfoundland circumnavigation. So lots of different options.
Yeah, I'm super excited. I think these are just such a great complement to all the, the walking, the cycling, the sailing, the canoeing, the kayaking, the skiing trips. This is kind of, the last missing piece of the puzzle is how do you get to these really remote places? So I want to say thanks for joining and sharing this. You got me excited about all these different places. And what's wild is as a Canadian, I haven't ever been to the North. And I think there's lots of people, in Canada, the US, that haven't explored this, wonderland in our backyard. So if you're thinking of doing one of these trips, there's 3 weeks to make a decision and save 25%. You don't save 25% in travel these days anymore. Everything's going up with inflation. So you can lock in 2025 prices and save some money. So I'll put links to these trips in the show notes. And once again, Martin, thanks for coming on the show and sharing your expertise and obvious passion for the Arctic.
Oh, my pleasure, Richard. I appreciate the invite and happy to chat with you about Adventure Canada. I'm super passionate about what we do.
Excellent. And with that, thanks to everyone for listening to this episode of the 10 Adventures podcast. We'll be back with more adventures next week, so stay tuned. Bye-bye. Start planning your own adventure by visiting us at 10adventures.com and listen to other episodes of the 10 Adventures podcast on Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else you find your podcasts.